You think the Wild West was ruled by the fastest gun or the shiny badge of a heroic sheriff, but that is Hollywood lying to you. The true ruler of the frontier wasn't a person at all. It was a simple, terrifying piece of agricultural equipment made of hemp. The rope didn't just punish crime. It was the only thing stopping the entire American expansion from collapsing into absolute anarchy. Here is the thing about frontier justice that sounds completely backwards to modern ears. Waiting for a fair trial would actually get everyone killed faster than the criminals would. You heard that right. In the vast, empty expanse of the territories, the concept of innocent until proven guilty was a luxury that honest settlers simply couldn't afford. The geography was literally everywhere around you, suffocating any attempt at civilization, but attempting to hold a prisoner in that geography made the community panic and start shutting down. The logistical reality of the frontier was about 10 times harsher than what your history books handle. When you caught a killer, your town faced a brutal economic calculation that most people today can't even comprehend. To hold a prisoner meant feeding him from your own dwindling winter stocks, guarding him while your own crops rotted in the field, and risking that his gang would ride in and burn your town to the ground to break him out. Keeping a criminal alive was physically dangerous for the entire collective. It's like trying to keep a rabid wolf in a cardboard box in your living room. Eventually, someone is going to get bitten. Cowboys and settlers figured this out the hard way during those first bloody years of expansion. The frontier towns were basically islands of humanity in an ocean of wilderness, with zero support from the federal government in Washington. Justice back then wasn't about morality or high-minded ideals. It was about waste management. Settlers had to choose between being moral citizens who let criminals walk free because there was no jail to hold them, or becoming murderers themselves to establish order. Most chose the rope, thinking they would figure out the morality later. Bad choice? Maybe. But the alternative was watching their communities dissolve into predator-prey dynamics day after day. Desperate towns would try to elect a sheriff, but without a budget or a courthouse, a badge was just a piece of tin. The irony was perfect and deadly. Cowboys spent their lives trying to build a civilized society, but the foundation of that society required acts of supreme barbarism. Order meant death, and death meant that everything else, commerce, family, safety, became possible. But here is where the settlers had to get creative. They started developing tricks that would make modern judges horrified. Their first instinct wasn't always to kill, it was to make the problem go away. Just like pirates looked to the sky for rain, cowboys looked at the endless horizon and decided to use the vastness of the land as a prison. They tried banishment. They would strip a thief of his horse and gun, give him a canteen of water, and tell him to start walking towards the setting sun. The logic seemed sound. If the territory is huge, just push the trash somewhere else. It was the frontier equivalent of sweeping dust under the rug. But you couldn't just stand there and watch them walk for 300 miles. Smart criminals quickly realized that banishment was just a suggestion, not a sentence. A banished horse thief didn't have a spiritual awakening in the desert. He just got desperate, stole a horse from the next town over, and circled back with a vendetta. Crews would watch their solved problems, ride back into town 2 weeks later, armed with new weapons and a burning desire for revenge. Desperate settlers would try whipping or branding, marking the criminals so other towns would know to stay away. They'd crop ears or brand foreheads with letters like T for thief. But this just created a class of disfigured, angry men who had nothing left to lose. It turned petty criminals into hardened monsters who knew they could never reintegrate into society. It was like trying to put out a fire by throwing dynamite into it. The real problem with these early methods was that they relied on the criminal having shame, which they didn't. Banishment required cooperation. Branding required a society that cared. The frontier had neither. The soft punishments didn't deter crime, they organized it. Gangs began to form specifically because they were outcasts. They realized that if the town wasn't willing to kill them, the town was weak. They would raid settlements, take what they wanted, and laugh as they were banished again, only to return the next season. The settlers realized they needed to become justice experts, or risk watching their families die at the hands of men they had already punished 3 times. Unfortunately, the government wasn't coming to save them, which forced the settlers to look for more reliable solutions. They needed something that didn't depend on the criminal's conscience or the availability of a federal marshal. They needed a system they could control themselves, even when the law book said it was illegal. Cowboys might have thought they solved their problem with a rope, but executing someone is messy, traumatizing, and guilt-inducing. Doing it as a mob is chaotic, so they developed the Vigilance Committee. And no, this wasn't just a random angry mob with pitchforks. That is a movie myth. The most successful vigilance committees were highly structured, quasi-military organizations. They had a constitution, elected officers, and strict bylaws. We are talking about shopkeepers, miners, and cattlemen creating a shadow government overnight. They kept written records. They held trials, hasty ones, sure, but trials nonetheless with a prosecutor and a defense. This wasn't chaos. It was the engineering of consent. By formalizing the lynching process, they spread the guilt across the entire community. If everyone votes, no single person is the murderer. It was a psychological hack that allowed God-fearing Christians to commit capital punishment without losing their minds. They treated justice like a barn raising. Everyone lifts a beam. Everyone ties a knot. San Francisco Committee of Vigilance of 1856 is the perfect example of this industrial-scale justice. They didn't just hang people. They fortified a headquarters with sandbags and cannons, creating a literal fortress against the corrupt city government. They had thousands of members, their own marching battalions, and a level of discipline that rivaled the actual army. They proved that a mob could be more organized than the government it was replacing. But here is where things got psychologically interesting. The vigilantes realized that the actual hanging was only part of the equation. The real goal was terror. They needed a symbol that would do the work for them when they were asleep. They started developing codes and signals that would make modern graphic designers impressed. In Montana, the sequence 3777 started appearing painted on tent flaps, carved into saloon doors, and pinned to the jackets of dead men. What did it mean? Some say it was the dimensions of a grave, 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, 77 inches deep. Others claimed it was a warning that you had 3 hours, 7 minutes, and 77 seconds to get out of town. The obscurity was the point. It was a psychological weapon. When a roughneck rode into a mining camp and saw those numbers scrawled on a wooden post, he knew that the local vigilance committee wasn't playing games. It acted like a talisman to ward off evil. It transformed the atmosphere of a lawless camp into a surveillance state where the walls were watching you. Just like pirates used black flags to terrify victims into surrendering without a fight, Cowboys used these cryptic symbols to force criminals to self-deport. It was efficient. Why waste the energy hanging a man if you can scare him into the next territory with a bucket of paint? The weird part is, it actually worked. Crime rates in camps dominated by these symbols often dropped because the uncertainty of the threat was more terrifying than the sheriff's jail cell. A sheriff has to follow rules. A number painted on a door answers to no one. But when symbols failed and the criminals stayed, the Cowboys had to turn to the hardware. And the hardware was the rope, but not just any rope, and not just any knot. You might think hanging is simple. Put a rope around a neck and pull, but doing it right was a science that fascinated the frontier. A bad hanging was a disaster. If the drop was too short, the victim strangled to death, dancing the hempen jig for 20 minutes while the whole town watched in horror. It was gruesome, loud, and traumatizing for the spectators. On the other hand, if the drop was too long, the physics of a falling body meeting a static rope resulted in, well, decapitation. That was too messy and considered unchristian. The Cowboys needed a sweet spot. They became accidental physicists of death. They started obsessing over the hangman's knot. This wasn't your standard Boy Scout loop. A proper jack-catch knot had a specific number of coils, traditionally 8 to 13, which served a mechanical purpose. The massive bulk of the knot acted like a hammer. When the body dropped and the rope went taut, that heavy knot was positioned right behind the left ear. The sudden impact snapped the neck bones, specifically the axis vertebra, severing the spinal cord. Lights out. Immediate unconsciousness. It sounds morbid, but this humane technology was crucial for the community's psyche. It turned a torture session into a medical procedure. The long drop method, calculated based on the victim's weight, became a trade secret shared between executioners. They were doing math to ensure a clean kill. The irony was brutal. These men, who often couldn't read a Bible, were calculating force equals mass times acceleration to ensure they didn't traumatize the women and children watching the show. They treated the mechanics of execution with the same care they treated the shoeing of a prize horse. But the real problem with all these methods? Infrastructure. The frontier didn't have gallows. Building a proper platform with a trapdoor took time, lumber, and skilled carpentry, resources that were scarce on the open range. So, desperate times called for desperate architecture. Cowboys started repurposing the world around them into instruments of justice. They didn't need a platform, they needed gravity. Bridges became the preferred venue. A bridge offered a guaranteed drop without any construction required. But when trees and bridges weren't available in the flat scrublands, things got creative. They used wagon tongues. They would prop up a wagon tongue, the long wooden pole that horses pull, using ropes to hold it high. It was precarious, unstable, and terrifying. They would sit the condemned man on a horse, tie the rope to the raised wagon tongue, and then slap the horse's rear. The horse runs out, the man stays put, and gravity does the rest. It was crude, it was effective, and it utilized the tools of their trade. The very equipment used to bring life and supplies to the West was inverted to bring death. Then there is the strangest innovation of all, the automated execution. Some crews got so sophisticated, or perhaps so averse to being the one to actually pull the lever, that they engineered booby traps for justice. In Goldfield, Nevada, there are stories of complex contraptions where the condemned man essentially executed himself. They would set up a system involving water buckets with slow leaks. The victim would stand on a precarious balance beam, with a counterweight bucket slowly filling with water or draining out. As the physics shifted over 10 or 20 minutes, the balance would tip, dropping the trap door. This allowed the vigilantes to say, technically, no man killed him, time killed him. It washed their hands of the direct sin. It was the frontier version of Pontius Pilate, washing his hands, mechanized. They built machines to outsource their guilt. However, even these clever mechanical tricks had a major flaw: speed. A vigilance committee took time to organize. A hanging took time to set up. And on the frontier, time was the one thing you didn't have when a gang was riding away. This is where the concept of the Posse Comitatus went from a legal term to a weapon of war. The sheriff had the right to deputize any able-bodied male on the spot. If he pointed at you and said, "Get your gun," you were no longer a baker or farmer. You were the law. This created a roving, high-speed justice system that required zero infrastructure. The posse was a mobile court. They didn't bring the prisoner back to the jail, they brought the jail to the prisoner. If they caught up to the bandits in a canyon, the trial happened in the saddle, and the sentence was carried out on the nearest cottonwood tree. It was efficient, but it was also terrifyingly prone to error. A posse running on adrenaline and whiskey wasn't exactly checking for alibis, but to the frontier mind, a few mistakes were the cost of doing business. Better to hang 2 innocent drifters and 1 guilty murderer than to let the murderer escape. The sheer scale of this impromptu justice system is something most people forget. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was the standard operating procedure for decades. In the absence of federal reach, the rope became the federal government. It was the ultimate deterrent, the final judge, and the only tax collector that everyone respected. And the weird part is, this system, as barbaric as it was, actually laid the groundwork for modern American policing. These weren't just chaotic outbursts. They were the primordial soup of organized law enforcement. The mug books that bounty hunters and vigilance committees compiled, sketches and descriptions of bad men passed from town to town, were the great-grandfathers of the FBI's most wanted list. They created information networks. A horse thief branded in Texas was known in Kansas before he even arrived, thanks to the Pony Express of vigilance intelligence. Cowboys discovered that information was more powerful than a Winchester rifle. If you knew who the bad guys were, you didn't have to fight them. You just didn't let them into your town. This network of informants, the use of visual identification, and the concept of cross-jurisdictional cooperation all started not in a police academy, but around campfires where men were trying to figure out who to hang next. The Rogues Gallery, a collection of photographs of criminals, was perfected by detective agencies like the Pinkertons, who operated much like corporate vigilance committees. They took the raw data collection of the lynch mobs and professionalized it. So in a very uncomfortable way, the modern database of criminals that keeps you safe today shares its DNA with the crude lists scrawled by angry mobs in 1880. But let's look at the emotional toll. Living in a society where you might be called upon to kill your neighbor to save the town does something to the collective psyche. It creates a culture of extreme suspicion and extreme solidarity. You trusted your neighbor because you had to, but you also watched him because you knew what he was capable of. The code of the West wasn't just about hospitality. It was a survival pact. If you violated the pact, the protection was withdrawn, and you were back in the wilderness, alone against the rope. This binary, you are either with us or you are dead, defined the social structure of the expansion. It explains why frontier hospitality was so generous and frontier vengeance was so absolute. There was no middle ground. Modern neighborhood watch programs rely on the same psychology as the 3777. The sign in your yard that says "protected by security system" is the modern equivalent of the painted warning on the saloon door. It's a symbol meant to terrify the predator into moving to an easier target. We like to think we are civilized, that we have moved past the rope and the wagon tongue. But the instinct remains when the system fails, when the police take too long, when the technicalities of the law let a predator walk free. You see the old ghost of the Vigilance Committee rise up in internet forums and community meetings. The Cowboys proved that order is fragile, and maintaining it sometimes requires methods that civilized people pretend to despise. They didn't hang people because they loved death. They hanged them because they loved life, and they were willing to do the dirty work to protect it. The rope was brutal, the drop was deadly, and the justice was often blind in the worst way. But it worked. And in a land where everything was trying to kill you, from the weather to the water to the wildlife, working was the only metric that mattered.